So thank you everyone for staying with us until this time. We're going to have a little conversation which will very soon open for any questions that may be in the audience. And as you might have realized from the credit, from the titles, this is actually a collaborative work, a work of writing between, a work between four people. And I thought that it would be good to start from the beginning, also thinking about how you often reflect about the importance of writing in your practice. If you would like to tell us more how this exercise of collective thinking and collective making came into being.
Well, it first came into being when Yanling, the main researcher, is this?
It is, but
okay,
it's very
it's
annoying.
What we have. Okay, came to visit me in California and told me about these masses of snails that they were pulling out of the fields. And I said, wait, this would be a great project to do together. The actual writing of it was a real feat of multi-continental composition, mainly over extremely long Skype meetings across 3 continents. So it was quite amazing that it was possible to do, but it was a fun team that we had short visits in Taiwan, and then the people in Taiwan sort of taking more footage. Isabel Carbonell is the main filmmaker, but Joël Chevrier also did some filmmaking there. So it was a choreographed, co-written, and co-conceived piece.
And why did you decide to choose the format of a text that can become a play and can be performed as a way to convey and render this experience with others?
We started with the idea of film and text, and Isabel said, I refuse to make an ethnographic film that's just an illustration of a text. And I thought, well, actually good, because I refuse to write a text that's just an explanation of an ethnographic film. So then we started to think, what kinds of precedents are there for giving visual and narrative media equal play as partners? You know, and we had a really hard time thinking of good precedents. That's where we first came to opera, which is not about text and visual, but about song and words having equal parts in composing the composition. And by chance, Yanling reminded us of the Taiwanese opera in which it's grassroots and queer and full of the kind of vernacular vitality, especially this one called Opela, which came up during Japanese colonialism as a way of staying cool with Japanese censors at the same time as these rural, cross-dressing, strange plots could happen. And they came up with mixtures of many different genres. So in the spirit of Opela, we decided our multi-genre piece could express some of the things we wanted, which included the presence of non-humans as well as humans, of ghosts as well as living people, I'm not sure you could tell that there was a scholar and a farmer and a ghost that were each performing their own ways of doing the situation. So we wanted all of those multiple perspectives to be there at the same time in a kind of polyphonic relationship to this landscape that they're all making together. So we wanted as many ways of making that landscape as possible to overlap with each other.
I mean, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this.
Okay.
Has meant so much to us to have you around all day and for this. But maybe sort of riffing on the notion of multi-genre or of having not one thing illustrate another, I was really struck by some of the words that were used for the entire day to describe a kind of necessity for each discipline to open out, self-break, turn towards, collaborate, include, and so on. And for some reason, anthropology seems to be that discipline which tends to do that particularly well, or at least the most radical edges of anthropology. And I was thinking, the words that were used, I think it was Hannah spoke about ontological fracture, Germain and Anaïs spoke about speculative fabulation. You spoke over the last 2 days in different venues of landscape structures and things being patchy and things that are intended as infrastructural and orderly becoming feral. So this is an incredibly vague question about the collaboration between disciplines, but also what is happening at the inside of disciplines, where disciplines are finding that those very same methodologies of the discipline can be deployed almost against themselves in relation to others. And I feel like you've broken such ground. I mean, that might not be the right metaphor in this context, but you've done so much of that work. So I guess one question is about your own work doing that and what led you to do that. And the other one is, how is anthropology at the center of this thing? Because I feel like it is.
I think it is, but there's also real resistance. I mean, I think I loved it when Hannah Lendecker before said, my protagonist is this chemical byproduct of the bacteria. And here, I'm trying to have multiple protagonists all at the same time. And anthropology resists that, even as it's also the place that's probably the most open to it among all the disciplines. And yet, it's a set of challenges about displacing human protagonists as the only ones who get to tell these stories. So it's both a place where one can begin to do this work, and one's always fighting against the boundaries.
And in a way, I mean, this idea of form being so crucial in anthropological thinking, right? In a way, that sort of move into friction, your next to last book, was a move into kind of form taking over, as it were, from, I guess, something else. I don't know, from what? That's the question.
Okay.
From
okay, well, maybe it's in this context where you're looking at many kinds of collaborations and experiments between artists and scholars of various sorts. I think those are really necessary to do the intellectual work that needs to be done about bringing humans and non-humans into the ability to be protagonists together. That these forms, to explain that problem, to try and show how it works, this seemed necessary rather than just an expository text that said, humans are not the only protagonists.
Can I ask you a question about enchantment? Because it feels to me like we've gone like this over the entire day on the kind of, we're all connected and everything is connected and it's beautiful and enchanting. And then not only with Golden Snail Opera, but also over the last 2 days, you've spoken about, but these connections, they make places less livable sometimes.
Less what?
Less inhabitable.
Yes.
And so there's I think Hannah, in fact, responding to your talk yesterday at the RCA, said, you seem to veer between hope and despair. But I feel like the entire method of seeing things, this ecological, expanded, complex method, veers between hope and despair at the same time, right?
I loved the phrase that you came up using Eve Sedgwick's categories in the beginning of redemptive paranoia. I thought that was a really useful way of seeing what's necessary and urgent in front of us right now, which is, on the one hand, to tell these stories of real terror that are going on that involves both humans and non-humans in really life-killing situations, but also, first, to do it in ways that brings us into the details, that makes us want to learn more, and that offers alternative threads that we might possibly follow. So that's exactly, I think, the challenge in front of us right now.
Before opening to the audience, I've been, based on the Golden Snail Opera, and how on the one hand it depicts agriculture as, even when done in a friendly manner by the friendly farmers as a set of antagonistic responses to different elements that are introduced in layers and layers. And led me to think about, in general, your work responding, reacting, talking close by and with the challenges made to the environment by a chain of effects of human-led action. So it's a very wide question, but I guess since you became such a major figure to think about the forms in which we may respond, we may learn to live in our times, how did the awareness of environmental and climate transformation affects and has been shaping your practice and your work?
Well, I've been doing this collaboration between biologists and humanists, including artists also, for the last 5 years in Denmark. And I'll admit, it's given me the opportunity to read some of the really terrible things that are going on that are shaping the new world that, Hannah Lendecker was also talking about, that on the one hand, the wonder of the mutualisms and the sheer complexity of these ecosystems that we're involved in we have all kinds of new tools and exciting new approaches. And on the other, the news about what the path we're creating for ourselves and how much is being destroyed in that process. It's hard to be wildly enthusiastic about business as usual right now.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Shall we open?
Yeah, do we have Graph Theatre's amazing performers around? It's the last call for you.
And maybe if people want to bring in stuff from the whole day, that's also possible, because I think the other speakers are still, at least mainly here, and could respond as folks want.
We can't see you very well.
It's difficult to see.
Oh.
Hi, Anna. Thank you for your wonderful theater piece. I am a designer, and I have a question about the non-human world and how we can make them somehow some kind of resources to give a new economical value to them, so that we can somehow unite the humans and non-humans to prepare for climate change and series of challenges that humanity and all other species are facing today. And I would like to hear how you think about this. Is that okay?
Sure. I think part of the problem with the legacy that we're trying to overcome at this point is that non-humans were seen exclusively as resources, and resources for human growth. Everything had to be a production machine. And what we missed in the process is the kind of havoc that was creating in ecological systems around the world. So the very first step, it seems to me, is to notice that there's other beings out there and that we depend on them, as everybody's been saying all day. We depend on them not just to eat, but to become who we are, that we can't be anything at all. We can't digest our food. We can't do a thing without many other species. And in that's the starting place, it seems to me, to figure out, is there a way that we can live together? I do feel quite good about these friendly farmers trying to come up with ways to consider all of those different animals and plants around them as more than resources. Yenling Tsai, the person who was the lead researcher on this, has written a new article where she's using Donna Haraway's category of odd kin to talk about surviving the Green Revolution, to come back to the sense of kinship with other species that has been part of farming communities earlier, but got wiped out in part by the promises of modernization and progress that suggested that if we just look at crops as single resources, somehow we would overcome our need for any others. But they're returning then to odd kin.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you for your answer.
Costas. Oh.
It's okay, Fergus is there, just here.
Thank you very much. I had a question, and perhaps it's also kind of can expand to the whole kind of feral project. And maybe I'm picking up also something that was a bit hard towards the end to hear, but would love to hear more about it now. The question of native versus like non-native in this question. And I think there is a moment in the film and in the text that kind of towards the end that the native snail kind of comes back, and perhaps bring what Hannah was talking about today, also this kind of metabolic ontology, right? Like how we start sensing through the metabolic, where does this kind of native and non-native starts breaking down, and can we kind of still kind of questions those kind of dichotomies? Because of course, and in each kind of political context, this has a very different meaning, and of course, like in the Taiwanese, I could assume this plays like a very specific role, like how the story is told. But this, of course, has been used in many different ways to serve like different agendas. So, in a way, how is that term being used in the story and throughout the project?
I thank you for that question, and I know many humanists, artists, etc., are very disturbed when biologists use those terms. But I think first of all, just because a species is from another place does not mean that it has invasive effects, that is, that it spreads out to the detriment of local ecologies. Second, I think instead of thinking native in terms of nationalism, if you think about the importance of the indigenous presence, this will help. That just as indigenous peoples have been wiped out by the genocide of invasion, so too have indigenous ecologies. And that when we think about, so this is not just the fact of being foreign, but the programs of introduction, including these golden snails, are really a part of a settler colonialism. And that if we think of the kind of basic invasive species as something like the lawn, where the lawn is part of a program for living that settlers have brought into so many areas around the world, and that it wipes out native, indeed, ecologies, not because it's part of a nationalist program, but because it's part of settler colonialism. So it helps me to see some historians have used this term creatures of empire, that is, creatures that help to build the imperial presence around the world. And so we need to pay attention to the actual dynamics. Not every foreign species is causing problems, right? But the ones that are often, as in every case I know, are part of programs that I see as part of settler colonialism.
Can I just ask you a follow-on question from that to do with toxicity and where toxicity goes? Because in a conversation that we had with Elizabeth Pavanelli in the preparation of the whole sort of research before, she was thinking about this redistribution of toxicity. She says if we really want to get to the crux of it, you know that if you clean up a place, you're then going to dump the toxic material somewhere else. And if you live as I do in the place that I do, you know that somewhere else is right there. So if we need to think about redistribution, we also need to think about the redistribution of toxic things. Now, in a context such as the patchy, messy, feral sort of products of empire in a feral atlas-like context within which you would place it, where does the toxic material, where is it? Where does it go? Where does it stay? How does it seep? I don't know.
Well, let me start completely concretely with this case, where commercial agriculture asked people to use poisons to kill these snails. And because you didn't even see the really big ones there because of the season that we were filming, but these snails can get really large, and the kind of poison that's going to kill a lot of large snails is also going to kill everything else, including us. So, and you're putting it in the water. In the water system is then full of these poisons. And that's on the one hand concretely about this place, on the other hand about every place that commercial agriculture is being conducted around the whole world. And the first victims of that toxicity are animals that have to live their whole lives in the water. That, in North America, for example, all the amphibians, the fish, the crocodiles, they can't reproduce anymore because of these hormone-disrupting toxins that have been fed them through these agricultural systems, and they're soaked in it all the time. So that's one of the first victims. But similarly, the regulations are lower in places where people are unable to protect themselves, and where so-called development and modernization programs are forcing people to use kinds of chemicals that they might not otherwise use. So indeed, patchiness brings in human inequalities as well as non-human ones. An anthropologist named Vanessa Agar-Jones, who's worked in the Caribbean on the island of Martinique about these banana nematode killing poisons that have just gotten in all the air and the water, and everybody in the island practically is contaminated by this, because even after the US considered it illegal to produce this chemical, in the Caribbean it was used anyway. So that's part of the problem with patchiness.
I would like to ask something that comes in the wake of the talk that you gave 2 days ago at the Royal Anthropology Institute, in which you, at least for me, introduced a new way of conceptualizing the Anthropocene by seeing the Anthropocene as a feral process. It was a feral response. So almost all of a sudden, I had a quasi-animistic relation to the Anthropocene as seeing as a feral entity. And relating to another term that is often used to describe species that manage to survive and to thrive in environments that are not necessarily theirs originally, and modes of adaptation, thinking about the pest. If you have a feral and the pest, where would you place a boundary between one and the other? Because
ferals and pests?
Pests, in the sense that these snails here, we could see them as feral,
yes,
but they are a pest also in the sense of being an invasive species. So I was just wondering, navigating through these terms that we use to define how you...
For me, feral means very wrapped up in human plans, enabled by industrial and imperial infrastructures, and going its own way. That's my definition of feral. And on the one hand, we need feral, so I would not trash the feral, that when forests grow up in an abandoned parking lot or a field that's not being used anymore, that's the kind of ferality that we need. On the other hand, there's so many also terrible ones, of which pests would be one example of the feral. And as long as they're pests that stay in the field where they have been cooked up, they're not an Anthropocene problem, in my opinion. It's only an Anthropocene problem when they jump over the fence and they get into the whole rest of the world and they destroying everything around them. Then we've got an Anthropocene problem in their hands. That is a problem that's going to block the resurgence of the multi-species ecosystems on which we depend and which we've been a part through the whole evolution of human bodies and ways of life. And now we're attempting to make that impossible.
Do we have a couple last questions?
This is a question that can be answered by any of the people that have spoken today, because it's kind of drawing on the larger theme of we have never been one. And when thinking about the idea of kind of ourselves as multiplicities, I started to think about what separates us, and one thing that came to mind was our perception, especially when we were talking about pain before, but also kind of thinking about the idea of our inability to perceive certain phenomena on a spectrum such as colour, that what we would say other organisms can perceive. And I was wondering kind of where this separation and kind of privacy comes from and what it does, because it kind of in some ways contradicts the idea of ourselves as multiplicities.
Well, I'll take it first, but then others can chime in. I mean, it seems to me in the 20th century, the exceptionalism of humans was so exaggerated that you can find thousands of studies that show that humans are the only ones who use tools, know how to play, think clearly, anything you want. Humans are supposed to be different. And it's why it's our challenge now to think of ways that 20th century set of approaches might not be the best answer to where we are now. Where I think the real excitement now lies is in our ability to notice similarities between who we are as bacterial enactments and who all the other kinds of beings on Earth are also in many ways similar, and that the kinds of techniques I'm most excited about developing are those that show me how to attune to forms of life that are on the one hand, of course, quite different than me, like a plant, for example. So I'm not going to have a conversation using language with a plant, but I think there's lots of ways I can learn the way it grows and see, how those electric potentials that we were hearing about in the last talk, how so many features of our way of life are actually not as different as the 20th century made us believe. But others, please feel free to join in.
I think maybe we take the last.
Maybe.
We might have to take the last question. Unless we take two at the same time and then answer them in the same answer.
Not a last question because it's not very intelligent or pertinent, really. But I think there's something really interesting in the kind of othering of the natural world and the fact that the further we move towards kind of a linked or like a kind of hyperlinked society, that the natural world recedes further and further away, and the kind of our ability to connect with that and communicate with that on a personal level becomes more and more difficult. And I just wondered, like, through this work and through the work that you've done, if you kind of recognize, othering is such a kind of, cliched and hackneyed a phrase, but it feels to me that there's a disconnection that is becoming more and more apparent as we become less and less connected with the reality of like where we come from and how we exist as organisms. I don't even really know where I'm going with that, but yeah, sorry.
You want to take another one?
Last thought, last question. I saw right over there.
Hi, I'm a tremendous fan of your work on matsutake mushrooms, and in that you show how the people who pick them are performing freedom, and so within sort of a global capitalist system, they're not alienated from their labor because it's caring and joyful and at one with nature. And I felt that this work echoed that, and maybe this is a good follow-up to the previous question about how the natural world is othered. I was wondering how would you suggest that people laboring in sort of typical sort of capitalist milieus that are far from nature, where they are alienated from their labor, how would you suggest that they use the insights in your research to free themselves?
So to the first question, the problem is, yes, even as people push the rest of the world farther away, it comes back in what Isabel Stengers has called the revenge of Gaia. It comes back, and all of the pathogens that are going to kill humans are also part of that. And maybe that's part of my first response to the second question, too. A feminist theorist from China named Dai Junhua came to give a speech at my university last year, and I was quite surprised when someone asked her what to do about capitalism. And she said, in the answer to the question, she said, if we can't end capitalism, capitalism will end us. It was the kind of bold statement I hadn't heard for a very long time in the academy, but maybe really worth paying attention to, that even as many of us, all of us, because of our metabolisms, live both inside and outside capitalist logics. The capitalist logics to date have not been able to control our digestion, our many other parts of our lives. And yet, we have such a tight relationship to these taken for granted business as usual logics. It seems to me that we'd better get busy thinking about what kinds of alternatives might be available.
I mean, that's how we should. We better get busy. Let's do it.
Okay.
Anna, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all of you who stayed here.